Today we're going to look more carefully at the text of the story, The Whole Loaf. And I want to begin by making a general statement, which is that we're dealing with a story in which all the events that take place in the story are really taking place in the mind, the psyche of the mind. So, psyche.
No one knows.
Well, let's say within the consciousness of the main character. So the technique is to write as if these events are happening in the real world, as if he's actually walking here and he's speaking to someone named Dr. Kutiel Ne'eman, or there's a man in a carriage named Gressler. All of these figures are figures that are really different parts of his own conscience, or his own imagination, or his own mind. That is the technique. And it really resembles the way in which we understand what happens in dreams. So, especially after Freud in dreams, a number of things happen. One is that dreams don't follow the logic of realistic occurrences, or you can one moment be one place and then all of a sudden you're back being a child, or you're in a different country. In dreams, that kind of jumping from one thing to another can take place. But also that the different people we see in the dreams are really dimensions of our own feelings. And that's the situation in these stories as well. So Agnon began writing these stories in the 1930s. It was very confusing to his readers, because until that time he had written in a more conventional, regular way. He had written a lot about rabbis and students and telling tales, telling stories. And all of a sudden he's beginning to write stories that are very psychological and very symbolic. And the readers did not know how to read them, because so much that took place in the stories was fantastic. It could not really take place. And so it took a long time until the readers began to understand that Agnon was writing at a different level of psychological depth. So we want to take the Whole Loaf story, and I want to try to show you how this works, and also how Agnon is using Jewish symbols. He speaks a lot about the Sabbath and different laws, but he's really using those very particular Jewish rituals only as a way of speaking about what is a universal situation of human beings in general. And so I'm going to explain how this works at the beginning of the story, but I want you to kind of keep your mind open for how this applies to an attempt to describe what could be called the general condition of modern man. In other words, post-traditional man who lives in the modern world, modern European man. And I don't think it makes a difference whether it is, Protestant, Catholic, or Jewish, but it's the situation of how a modern person lives in the world. Within a world in which the values of tradition and the past are still present. They still make a claim on you, but you are not really fully and totally part of that. And that could be any tradition. It doesn't have to be Judaism per se. So these stories examine all the different ways in which a human being uses to avoid taking responsibility for his actions, her actions. The different means of denial, denying, of not taking responsibility, of wanting things to be nice and good, but not really working to do it. Now, there's all the things that are part of how all of us as human beings, to the degree to which we are imperfect, this is our situation. This is what is which defines the difficulties we have in living. So we have here a kind of interesting paradox. Here's a writer who's writing about the Sabbath and about the Torah and about the commandments. In other words, it would seem to be very particular to Jewish tradition, but the fact is he's using those only as a means, a vehicle for trying to understand the situation of human beings in the modern world. Okay? And again, this is very universal, but it applies to cultures in which there is the remainder or the persistence of a religious tradition and of those values. In other words, I don't know if this would be the same thing, let's say, in a post-Soviet world in which religious values were never, within the lifetime of 1 or 2 generations, were never there at all. Maybe ideology would function in that way, conceivably. But here, we're dealing here more with a situation where there is a honor or credit officially given to the values of religion and to morality, but the individual no longer lives totally within that world. He lives in the modern world, and he feels the conflict and the tension between his own desires and what is mandated, the values, what comes from the religious and ethical tradition. And what I think is very brave, very courageous about the stories is that Agnon speaks in the first person, the I, autobiographically, and the figure he presents here is a figure who is not very ideal and not very admirable. It's somebody who, in the end, looks like a ridiculous person. At the end of the story, where does he end up? He spent the night on the floor of the restaurant together with the mice, and he's learned nothing at the end. In other words, if you pay attention to the last sentence of the story, where does the last sentence of the story bring you? Anybody remember? It brings you right back to the first sentence of the story. It's as if this whole evening has taught him nothing. He hasn't learned anything. It's one thing that you undergo a lot of difficult experiences, and even though it's been painful, you've learned something. Yes, you've gained something. But in this story, it is for nothing. Because in the end, he's exactly back where he was in the very, very first sentence. So when I speak of Agnon's bravery, it's bravery in taking the I, the me, and putting it out there as a person who is comical, who is unsuccessful, who is dumb, who can't learn, and who is an object of ridicule. So that takes some, I think, that takes some courage, because naive readers usually identify the writer with the person, with the I in the story. Now, I hope you're more sophisticated and you know that not to confuse the narrator of the story with the the writer writing the story. They're not the same. But when a writer writes a story and uses the I, he has to expect that readers are going to think of that he is the person, that this is the hero of the story. Now, in the very beginning of the story, the narrator says that it's set in Jerusalem, it's during the summer, very, very hot, and it's the end of the Sabbath. Now, the assumption here is that the narrator is an observant Jew of some sort, and that during the Sabbath, you can't cook meals for yourself. You have to prepare for the Sabbath before the Sabbath. And that is part of the observance of the Sabbath, that you make soup and you make food and meals and have it ready so that the Sabbath itself is supposed to be a pleasure. It's supposed to be a time where you're not working, where you're enjoying your family, praying, studying, and all of the hard work of preparation and cooking has to be done before the sun sets on Friday. Okay, that's the ideal. So what is the situation of the narrator here? Where is he? What has he done?
He done nothing.
He's done nothing. And so he's done nothing. And so what's the consequences of that? He has this 24 hours of the Sabbath, very, very hot. And what situation is he in?
He's very hungry.
He's hungry. He's hot. And he thought that maybe he'd go to a hotel. There are hotels where you pay after the Sabbath and so forth. But he doesn't go because he's so hot and he's so hungry. So he can't go. So we have an idiom in English. You make your bed and you lie in it. I don't know if there's something equivalent in Russian or Ukrainian. In other words, you have to deal with a situation you've made for yourself. You didn't make your bed, you can't lie in it. Or, whatever you do for yourself, that's it. And that's the situation here. So he's somebody who has not cared for himself. He's not taken the trouble to think ahead, to make food, to take care of himself. So, but yet he is religious enough that he would not cook food himself on Sabbath. So he's stuck, hungry and hot. And that's the little prison that he's made for himself. What other fact is important about the narrator? Why is he so alone?
His wife and children go
abroad.
That's right. And later in the story that becomes important, because at the beginning of the story it's stated as if that's the fact. They're off someplace else, visiting or on vacation, and the poor guy, he's left alone. But later in the discussion with Dr. Natman, the question comes up about the fact of why are they abroad? Why has he not taken the trouble to make it possible for them to come back? Why hasn't he invested some energy in bringing the family together? So his being alone is also a situation that he's created, and he's created a situation where his wife and his children have to be alone as well. And we have something here of gender roles. If his wife was there, she would have prepared the food before the Sabbath and he'd be able to be happy and eat and so forth. She's away. All of his needs, he says, all of them are on me. I have to take care of myself. And if you think of it, that is a very profound statement. In other words, in life, in the end, each of us is alone and we have to take care of ourselves. And people help us, we're in relationships with other people. But the first paragraph of the story is an attempt to present the human situation in a kind of a raw form. He is alone. He's responsible for being alone. If he took more trouble, he wouldn't be alone and he would be cared for, but he has to take care of himself, and the fact that he is uncomfortable and hungry is a result of his own actions. So right away you see that the issue of the Sabbath isn't so much about religion, and it's not about whether he's a religious Jew or not a religious Jew, but it becomes a vehicle, a means for portraying human beings in general. And this is my theme, I'll keep saying it over and over again, that the particular rituals and symbols of Judaism and Jewish life here are not what's important, but they're used as a way to investigate and explore the dilemma of human beings living in a world where you're on your own and you can't rely on other structures such as religion or family. You have to take responsibility for yourself. There's a lot in these stories that reminds me of existentialism as a movement in France, you know, Jean-Paul Sartre and others, and of their phrase in French of mauvaise foi, bad faith. Bad faith isn't the faith of religious belief, but it's the lies you tell yourself, the denial of the truth through the various kinds of refusals to really accept responsibility for why things are the way they are. So here he blames the Sabbath, he blames the absence of his family, he blames the heat for the situation that he's in. So, on the second page here, I'm using the English, the Sabbath finally comes to an end, according to Jewish law, after it becomes dark on Saturday night. The special Sabbath rules no longer apply. You can use money and travel and write and prepare food and so forth. And so you think maybe he would, you know, put on the flame and cook something for himself, but this story is not about taking care of yourself. It's about expecting to be taken care of by other things, by others. And so the first thing he does is to leave his home. Okay? And again, in all of Agnon's writing, and especially in the second story we'll discuss today, home is very important. Home is the place where a person should be with one's loved ones, taking care of yourself, and being rooted, being centered, being at home. In the second story we read, the problem is he goes from room to room. What is going to be the room where he could be comfortable? Where's the place for him? What could be a place where he could actually rest and sleep? Here, his own room or house, he, in a sense, drives himself out of it. He can't stay in it. He has not prepared it in a way that he can find rest or food or coolness there, so he goes out. So we have a scene of Saturday night in downtown Jerusalem. This is Jerusalem of the 1930s, British Mandate, and Jerusalem is a multicultural city. You see all sorts of head coverings. Mm-hmm. You see the ultra-Orthodox Jews with the Steinlach. You see Arabs with their headdress. You see ottomans with a tarbush. Everybody is escaping the heat of the day now that it's cooler, and people are mixing in the street, and businesses are opening, shops and kiosks of various sorts. And he is on his way to do what? What's his goal?
Go on the street and looking for some restaurants, hotels.
Yes, he's going to go to a restaurant.
Yes.
He's going to have a meal, right? Again, here in Agnon, restaurants are not quite what they are in our experience, which is, it's something that's a convenience and it's a social place. Here it's the place where you go to be taken care of because you can't take care of yourself. There's no wife. He doesn't bother to take care of himself. So the restaurant is the place where he's going to sit down and they're going to serve him. They're going to take care of him. In other words, everything that he has lacked, that's been missing during this very hot time when he's been hungry and uncomfortable, is now going to be, he's going to find the sense of being taken care of that he's missed. Okay? It doesn't end well, right? It doesn't work out for this man, this we know. And the whole story is what happens on the way. He's trying to get there. He gets to the restaurant eventually, but he never gets to the food. So again, the idea of leaving your home. It's not leaving voluntarily, but being cast out or thrust out because it's not really a home. You haven't made it a home. You've driven your wife away and you haven't taken care of yourself. And so the very first step, the premise is one of this kind of bad faith, of getting someone to take care of you. And he's moving, so the movement, the physical movement, from the house into the street, toward the hotel, and along the way things happen. He goes into Dr. Nehman's house, and then later on he's on his way to the post office to deliver the letters, and this carriage with horses and this man from his past, Gressler, disturbs him, and then he picks himself up and goes to the restaurant. So these movements, these spatial movements along the road and the interferences are a map of psychic or spiritual events, as we'll see. In other words, so what is in space is really inside the self. That's the premise, again, of these stories. That all the events that happen on the surface are really events that are taking place inside the soul or the psyche of the protagonist. Now, at the very beginning, he goes by a house, and there's a man inside who knocks on the window and tells him to come in. Okay? This man is named Dr. Yekutiel Nehman. Now, if you were reading this in Hebrew, and if you're reading Hebrew, you would have some kind of training in Jewish culture, you would know automatically that these two names are among the various names that are given to Moses in the Bible. And Ne'eman in Hebrew means faithful, the faithful one. Yekutiel is another name for Moses. Moses has many names in the Bible. So if Agnon makes a character, Yekutiel Nehman, you know already that it is allegorical. It's not a real person, but it's something associated with the Torah. And he makes him a doctor, also a wise man of some sort. Now, in the first exchange with Dr. Nehman, The narrator says, oh, I went over to him, he signaled to me. He's a great sage. It's as if it's a compliment to the narrator that Dr. Netman wants to see him. But the first thing that Dr. Netman asks him is, Dr. Netman asked me how my wife and children were. I sighed and answered, oh, you reminded me of my trouble. They are still abroad and want to come back to the land of Israel. And then Dr. Netman says, if they want to come back, why don't they come back? I sighed and says, there is some delay. And then Dr. Netman says, he replies with a kind of saying, verily the delay comes from a crooked way. So tell me, what has happened here? Why has Dr. Netman asked about the wife and children?
From religious way, wife and children are some
Very important.
very significant.
Just in religion?
No.
In life.
And when he asks about them, is he just making pleasant conversation? The way you meet somebody in the street and you say, oh, how's the family? Is it just very conversational? His reason for asking?
What's going on in your life, like in your private life, in your inner world, if it's kind of it? Okay.
So he's asking because he knows that there is something wrong. So the question is a real question. Where are they? And how does the narrator answer? What are the kinds of answers he gives? Does he really answer the question?
No.
He doesn't know how are they. He says that they are abroad, they are not near him.
And what kind of an answer is that?
He doesn't answer the question directly.
That's right. And he's not doing it necessarily because he's such a private person, but why is he not answering directly?
Maybe he thinks his responsibility for this battle.
That seems to come from what Dr. Netman says. You know, you say they're abroad, so why are they abroad? And you know, why don't they come back? And he says, oh, there's some delay, the narrator. And Dr. Netman says, essentially, you're the delay. It's because you haven't taken the trouble to arrange for their transportation, to take care of it, or perhaps you prefer that they're not there. And so again, right here we have this, in this brief exchange, the denial of responsibility for a situation which is imperfect, and the narrator not willing to admit it, not willing to say in English to own up to it, and to Dr. Netman, who's this great figure, he says, I don't know, there's some problem. He's not willing to relate to it seriously. And Dr. Netman scolds him. He is a figure of moral authority and tells him that, you know, this isn't right. And the narrator's response is very interesting. Listen to this. I looked down at the ground in shame and said nothing. So what kind of response is that?
Infantilism.
Yes, it's very infantile or very adolescent in some way. I mean, one possibility he could have said, you know, gee.
He's feeling guilty that his family is not...
Well, you know, in English we make a difference between guilt and shame.
Oh, shame. He's
You know,
in shame.
guilt is when you really feel bad about something, and shame in, you know, in English,
It's slightly...
it has to do with how you're viewed from somebody else, not how you feel inside, but you feel exposed. You feel that somebody's looking at you and that what's missing in you can be seen by everybody. He feels shame, but not guilt. If it was real guilt, that would be the beginning of some kind of inner self-examination. But no, he feels shame. So he's silent. He does not, he's been given a moral rebuke, but rather than engaging in it, he's kind of arrested or paralyzed. He's not willing to really acknowledge it. He digs in. And the way he deals with this, listen to this. I regretted having brought his wrath down on me. His wrath is his anger. I regretted bringing Dr. Netman's wrath down upon me and causing him to bother about such trifles. What's a trifle? Something that's unimportant, an unimportant detail. So already this isn't unimportant, but the narrator is making it unimportant, the question of his family being away. It's so as if he's saying, oh, I really regret upsetting Dr. Netman. He shouldn't have to get angry about things that are so unimportant, my family business and so forth. Again, that's a way of putting it at a distance. And so how does he deal with Dr. Netman's anger? So I took counsel with myself and began to talk about his book, the book that Dr. Netman wrote. And he goes on to praise the book. Now again, the Hebrew reader knows that if Dr. Netman is a Moses figure, then the book must be the Bible, the Torah, the Bible, the book. And the narrator says in a very sophisticated way, listen here, that this was a book about which opinions were largely divided. People had different things to say about this book. There are some scholars who say that whatever is written in it is as if from the mouth of the Lord. It was written by Dr. Netman, who neither added nor took away anything from his words. There's one school of thought that says that the book is really God's word, and Dr. Netman just transcribed it. Okay? But there are some who say this is certainly not the case, and that Netman wrote it all himself and ascribed his words to a certain Lord whom no man ever saw. So there are others who say that the book is really the work of Dr. Netman himself, and he was to ascribe. He said it came from this Lord, but it's really his own work. So what do we learn about the narrator's view of the world from saying there are two opinions?
Agnosticism maybe, no?
Right, and this can't be the mind of somebody who is truly devout, truly pious, because in the pious worldview, the Bible is the Word of God. The idea that the Bible is the response of human beings to the experience of God is a more modern 19th, 20th century, what we call critical Bible criticism. These are attempts on the part of modern Jews to understand the Bible as being a human document that's inspired by God. There are very different opinions about it. So the narrator is somebody who looks at these things from a distance, as if you would summarize it. Yes, there are those who believe in the divine Torah, there are others who don't. And then he goes on to try to, as we say in English, suck up to compliment, to, what are other words for it, to flatter Dr. Netman. He says, everybody admits that it's a great book, there's nothing like it. And he's doing this, and why is he trying to flatter Dr. Netman? What's his purpose, his motive?
Because he made him angry the minute before about talking about his family. And
Yeah.
he wants to make himself.
Well, he wants to turn attention away from himself. Dr. Netman has just pointed his finger at him and said, you know, you're not right. You know, you're responsible. And he wants to turn it around and deflect attention away from himself and to flatter him. English has so many words for to suck up to butter up, and I'm sure that other languages do as well. So it's a tactic to turn attention, the focus away from himself and on to Dr. Netman. And it's also extremely patronizing. Patronizing. It's as if somebody were to say, the Bible, yes, it's a very good book. You know, people say that it has good qualities. There's something very trivializing, and as if your opinion about the Bible is so important. So he's speaking with a kind of wisdom that he has no right to have. And he's doing it for false purposes. He's doing it, again, in order to get Dr. Netman not to look at him. And Dr. Netman's reaction is to refuse to be flattered. He looks away. Then Yukutiel turned his face from me, let me be, and went his way. Okay, so he didn't even respond to the flattery. He just turns and leaves. And then the narrator says, I stood eating my heart with grief and remorse for what I had said. So what does the narrator realize? Why is he feeling remorse? What's remorse? Remorse is regret, when you feel bad about something you've done. Okay, why does he realizes that he said the wrong thing, that he's tried to be indulge in false flattery, and he feels bad about it. But just in the way in which he felt shame before, he doesn't do anything with it. He just feels bad. Oh, I handled him wrong. I used the wrong words. I shouldn't have spoken to Dr. Netman in that way. But he doesn't really understand what is wrong. Now, for the purpose of the story, the key moment comes now. Dr. Netman has every right to say to him, get out of here. You know, I can't talk to you. You have no moral understanding. All you do is make excuses, right? But instead, he gives him a second chance. How? What does he do to give him a second chance?
He gives him
the letters, right? The letters. And asks him to deliver the letters, okay? And this is a very nice solution on Agnon's part. You have the Torah, right? The Torah is what is the God's revelation to Israel. And then later in history, the rabbis come up with the idea of the mitzvot, the commandments. So the rabbis, after the time of the Torah, try to analyze the Torah and to understand what exactly are the duties and the tasks that Jews are responsible for. And those tasks are called mitzvot. And it comes from the word for commandment, mitzvot. And so you have the Torah, and then you have the deeds, the tasks, the responsibilities of Jews. And so Agnon puts that in terms of Dr. Netman's book, and then the letters that Dr. Netman sends. Now, the letters, we don't know to whom they're being sent, but it becomes a responsibility, a mission. The narrator is the messenger. who is supposed to convey the letters. And all he has to do is deliver them to the post office. And he has to bring them to the post office because they're being sent registered mail. How would you say that in Russian? In other words, when you have to get a stamp to make sure that it's
Повідомлення.
Погашение.
kind of like guaranteed. You can't just put it in a box, but you get a slip of paper saying that it's been mailed to make sure. So it has to be.
It calls рекомендаційний лист, рекомендательное письмо.
Okay, I believe you. So that's the idea here. In other words, that he has to bring it to the post office, and it has to be processed by the clerk. And if he does that, then he will satisfy Dr. Nanman. Okay. So the question is, why? What are the obstacles in the way of doing something so simple? Okay. And it turns out to be not simple at all. The first problem is, we know that what the problem is, that he's very hungry. And the dilemma is, does he first satisfy his hunger and then deliver the letters when he'll feel better and he'll be in a good mood? Or should he perform the task of delivering the letters, even though he's hungry, and then he'll be able to sit down to his meal? And in the chapter 4 here, we have, to begin with, two things that prevent him from doing it: imagination and reason. Both of these in different ways. Again, things inside of himself that prevent him from doing it. So, imagination. Imagination in the sense of being able to think about things that aren't really here in the here and now. Before I had taken more than 2 or 3 steps, the power of imagination arrived. What it imagined, what it did not imagine, all of a sudden, it brought a sickbed before me. There's a sick man somewhere, I told myself, and Dr. Netman has been told about it and has written down a remedy for him. And now I have to hurry to take the letter containing it to the post office. So I got set to run to the post office. Okay. Now you might think that's a good thing, the imagination. In this case, it's giving him an incentive to go. What prevents him is he's using not the imagination, but logic and reasoning. In the middle of my running, I stopped and thought, is he the only doctor there is? And even if he is, does he promise that his remedy is going to help? And even if it does help, do I really have to put off my meal when I haven't eaten anything at all the whole day long? My legs grew heavy as stone. I did not go to eat because of the force of imagination. And I did not go to the post office because of my reasoning. So, in the one case, the imagination, the idea that if I don't get the letters in the mail, there's a sick person who is not going to get this remedy that's in the letters and so forth, that leads him to give up his meal and run to the post office. But on the other hand, he begins to reason, look, there are a lot of doctors, and who knows whether this prescription, this remedy, is going to do any good, and why should I give up my meal? And so he doesn't deliver the letters. So he's in a classic bind like this. He doesn't eat the meal, and he doesn't deliver the letters. He's paralyzed. And what paralyzes him, again, are different kinds of psychological forces. One is the power of the imagination to imagine things that aren't there, and the other is using logic and reason. And they intervene, one to cancel out one option, the other to cancel out another option. So again, the story in general, and Agnon is trying to deal with what is it inside of ourselves that prevents us from fulfilling ourselves, from making ourselves happy, from achieving our goals, for being what we want to be, or who we want to be. And in the story, he's trying to examine all of the internal mechanisms inside of the human being that make it so difficult for us to be fulfilled and arrive and achieve our goals. What happens next is that he's actually has decided he's going to go to the post office, and it's if you've been in Jerusalem, the post office is a post office that was built by the British in the 1920s and 1930s, and it's a very big post office, and the officials inside are British post office officials. He's about to go there and take care of this when there's a big intervention. There's a horse-drawn carriage that comes galloping down the streets of Jerusalem with a man in it named Mr. Gressler, who invites him to come onto his carriage. Now, what is so strange about there being a horse and carriage? The story indicates that.
Because nobody goes on streets.
This is the 20th century. These are cars. There are no more horses and carriages in downtown Jerusalem, which is a rather cosmopolitan city, the center of the mandatory Palestine. So right away we're alerted to the fact that there is something archaic or that doesn't belong to the present about this man, Mr. Gressler, so that he belongs to the past, or to a lower, earlier part of the narrator's experience. And in fact, we're told, where did he know Mr. Gressler? Where did he first meet him?
Before. And he doesn't like him. He is
Well,
irritated.
it's complicated. Certainly he knew him in Europe before he came to reign in Israel. And what was Mr. Gressler's role in his life?
He brings chaos and some...
Well, but
Ambivalent.
it's ambivalent. In other words, he's not like a Mephistopheles or a devil figure. You know, it's not. He says, what does the narrator say about his relationship with him in
They
Europe?
always destroy something.
How?
That's true too, but that they enjoyed each other's company.
Could
Yes.
it be a political symbol of old good Europe?
Well, again, we know that everything here has to be part of him. So it's not so easy to say that it's part of, let's say, worldly cosmopolitan Europe. There's something of that as well.
Also, it is said that he recollects his memory from Europe when his home was burned.
Yes, we'll get to that in a second. That's what made him leave Europe and come to there. But Mr. Gressler is very witty. He's always available to do what we say in English, to hang out. You know, what it is to hang out, to spend time together. In other words, he's available whenever the narrator isn't at work, isn't writing, isn't studying, isn't learning. In other words, when the narrator has time on his hands or is available for entertainment, there's Mr. Gressler. He's ready to play cards, he's always has witty stories, and the narrator laughs at them. He's very entertained, Mr. Gressler. It's as if he has a buddy, a friend, for drinking, for playing cards. So the next thing we learn is about the destruction of his house. In this story, the narrator has his apartment and his library on the floor above a textile merchant. The textile merchant is dishonest. He has a whole house full of ersatz fabrics that were made from inferior material during World War I that he can't sell because the war is over. And Mr. Gressler says, here, take this match. After he asks him, are you insured? Do you have insurance? Yes. And so burn down your stock, collect the insurance. But what happens is that it burns the home of the narrator as well. And that when the fire crew comes, that they're drunk, and rather than putting out the fire, they actually put alcohol in the fire and make it worse. It's, again, a kind of comedy of errors. So the narrator, the next we learn, is going to Palestine. You go to Palestine by ship at that time. And he is on the lower deck, third class. And who does he discover is also on the ship?
Mr. Gressler, but
Mr. Gressler, who is
he's on the much better.
Right, the first class. And then, so this is the crucial detail, that if Mr. Gressler was something external to the narrator, he would be back there in Europe, and the narrator would be able to leave him behind by changing the circumstances of his life and moving to Palestine and trying to become a better person. And he says that since the time his house burned down, he's been actually studying Dr. Natman's book. He's been trying to be more serious and leave aside Gressler. What does it mean that Gressler is a passenger on the ship with him?
They are
He's
in
one
the
of the
same
some-
boat.
He's one person of...
Yeah, that Gressler is part of himself. It's a part of himself that by definition he cannot leave behind, because Gressler is part of him. It's the unserious part. It's the cynical part of himself. It's the part of himself that is idle or is open to entertainment or to distractions, right? And that's, I think, part of the greatness of the story. Again, everything that's external is really internal. And Mr. Gressler is there with him in Palestine. The narrators thought that he's making a new life. He's going to become a new person by going up to the land of Israel and settling there, perhaps returning to religious practice the way that Agnon did when he himself returned to Palestine in 1924. But the fact is that when he moves from Europe to Palestine, he brings with him everything that is in his self, in his soul as well. And that's the Gressler part as well. And why the name Gressler? It's a diminutive from gross in German, vulgar, big, large. Gressler is. So that's the part of him, that's the vulgar part. And he's there in Jerusalem as well. And that's the part that is always available to play, is always available to be there at the moments when the narrator is tempted to escape responsibility. And here's the case where he has the intention to deliver the letters to the post office, but not in such a wholehearted and sincere way that there isn't a part of him that isn't available for Mr. Gressler when he comes along. Even if that wasn't his intention. Gressler comes and he says, climb aboard my carriage. He climbs aboard. In the end, they end up tumbling on the street, and he's full of dust and dirt. And at this point, he has no more strength to deliver the letters. I haven't eaten all day, as if that's something that somebody else had done to him. He hasn't eaten all day because he didn't prepare food before the Sabbath. And now he has to go and eat. And then we enter the realm of the restaurant. And that is pure kind of Kafkaesque slapstick comedy. He sits at the table. Now he feels everything is going to be okay. And all the waiters say, yes, whatever you want. Yes, we'll get it for you. Yes, yes, yes. And you think that now he's solved his problem. But he introduces a condition that makes it impossible. He says, I want this meal, this dish and that dish. And by the way, please bring me a whole loaf. And that's the title of the story. Okay, in Hebrew, it's pat shlema, a whole loaf of bread. And that becomes the problem. The food is there, but they keep bringing platters full of food, and he's salivating, and then they bring the food to the table next to him. And finally, when he thinks that this is my food, he gets up and he smashes into the waiter, and the food goes everywhere. That was his food. Now he doesn't have it. And why is it so delayed? Because they're preparing the whole loaf for him, which never comes, rather than slices of bread, which would be the normal thing. So again here, there is a clue in this notion of a whole loaf. It's a little complicated, because when in Jewish life do you need a whole loaf? Well, it's for the Sabbath table. During the week, if you eat bread, you get a piece of bread. You make a blessing on it and you eat it. For the Sabbath, you're supposed to have 2 whole loaves, not slices, but whole loaves. And it's various symbols that has to do with the 2 portions of manna. In the Bible, during the 40 years in the desert, the Jews had no food. They were given food by God. Manna from heaven. It's a word, I assume, that exists in Russian, Ukrainian as well, in English.
Manna.
Right? It's a Hebrew word from the Bible. And because of the Sabbath restrictions, on Friday, the Israelites were given a double portion of manna, so they would have food for the next day. Okay? And symbolically, that is why on the Sabbath table, you have 2 whole loaves. Right? So that is one possibility. In other words, we have a symbol here of the whole loaf. And it can be various things. So that's one direction, one interpretation, is that it has to do with something that when it comes to Jewish observance and ritual is very proper. It's according to the law of the Sabbath table. Another approach to this would be that it doesn't have anything to do with the Sabbath and Jewish law, but it has to do with wanting something that is harmonious, that is a whole. That what you want is not just food, but you want perfection, something that is round and whole and harmonious and not just a piece. So when he sits down to say he wants to eat, he's longing for something that is total and not fragmentary. Okay? There's no, in this story, It's a story that has many interpretations, and this is a symbol that has different meanings, different interpretations. So it's not that there's one right one and one wrong one. And it also could interpret, it could have something to do with how you understand his problem or his situation, or why he can't get his needs fulfilled. Is this story about a man who has been cut off from the true path of religious belief and observance? That's one option. If you took that option, you would say, yes, the Whole Loaf is about the Sabbath restriction. Or would you say this is about modern human beings whose problem is that they long for some kind of harmony or totality that isn't available in life. And because they're always looking for what's perfect, they never get to eat. They never get the thing itself. So the story can have, I think, bear several interpretations. One would be more of a Jewish interpretation, and the one would be perhaps more of a universalist interpretation. But in both cases, the issue is that because of what we long for, we can't obtain what we really need. Because we want something that is either ritually correct or perfect, we end up with nothing, with hunger, with lack of fulfillment, because we can't accept responsibility for something that's partial, that is real, that is very here and now. So, again, you can take this in different directions. But in all cases, what's very, I think, very strong about the story is the absurdity of the ending. So at the end, we have the man, and it seems to me like it's something like a Marx Brothers movie of some sort. I don't know if you've seen those movies. It's slapstick humor. In the end, where is he? He's just left in the corner. He hasn't eaten anything. He spends the whole night locked in the restaurant with the mice and with the cleanup crew, or with the leftovers from other people's meals. And the result of all of this is that he does not get to eat, and the letters are still there. They're soiled, they're dirty, and they have not been delivered. And on top of it all, there's no wisdom, there's no learning. This whole ordeal has not resulted in an insight or a bit of understanding. Oh, I've gone through this, and now I know that I have to do it differently next time. There's nothing of that. There's comic repetition, and it's part of the absurd comedy is when a figure keeps getting hit on the head and keeps putting his head up to get hit each time. That's part of the essence of comedy, of that comic repetition where there is no learning or insight, but a kind of compulsion to repeat the self-destructive behavior once again. So, that is our discussion of the Whole Loaf, and we'll spend a little... Any questions about that story before we go on? Please, yeah.
Yes, I'm curious about any investigations about parallels between Knut Gamsun hunger and this story, because it has a lot of elements which is common between Knut and Knut Gamsun.
From who?
Knut Gamsun. This is Norwegian Nobel Prize.
We say Knut Hamsun.
Oh, sorry.
No, I think you pronounce the H as a good. So we say Knut Hamsun. And his novel Hunger. It's a very good connection because at the time when Agnon was a young man, everybody was reading Knut Hamsun and other Scandinavian writers as well. So I think there probably is a connection. He was very much on the minds of young writers at that time. So I think that would be, something to explore as well. Or hunger as a metaphor. You also have in Kafka the story, The Hunger Artist, as well. So it's a very, very universal thing. Okay, other questions? Okay. I've spent a lot of time in the story because I wanted you to see it, the technique of, again, of the outward journey, which is really a map of the inner struggles, and this is, I think, Agnon's a great breakthrough for him. Now, in the story, which is called in English From Lodging to Lodging, from apartment to apartment, from house to house, the word in Hebrew is dira. Dira is an apartment or flat. Do you know what the word is for house?
Bayit.
Bayit, that's right. Bayit is the proper house, and it's also the word that's used for the Jerusalem temple during the times of the Bible and after the Bible as well. So when we say the Beit HaMikdash, the house of the holy, or when we talk about the destruction of the temple, we say Churban HaBayit. HaBayit, with the hay of the definite article, the house is the temple, the sanctuary. So in Agnon, that word, bayit, is an arch symbol. And again, it's important that the house is connected to the family, as we saw in the story about the kerchief. The house is not the synagogue, but it's the house. There are also combinations. Beit Knesset and Beit Midrash are words for synagogue and study house as well. But Agnon is using the word dwelling or house again in a metaphorical and symbolic way as a physical place that is the house for the human spirit, that is a place on earth where the human being lives and can find dwelling. These are very powerful terms. And so the search of the human being in some way can be expressed as a search for a place to be housed. In English we can use house as a verb as well. To house something is to give it a physical place, to give it a container. In English, when it's a noun, it's house. When we use it as a verb, it's to house. It's a little different. So the situation of the narrator in the beginning of the story resembles in some way the narrator at the beginning of the Whole Loaf. What's similar between the initial premise, the beginning of each story?
It's hard.
The hero is alone again.
Lonely.
He's alone, and in this case it's not hot and hungry, but
He's difficult to live. No, he's
Noise.
ill.
He's sick.
Noise.
He's sick. I mean, it's physical ailment, and it seems to be something that has no real name or diagnosis. He's sick, and the doctor keeps coming. There are all sorts of bottles, and he can't get well, and he's complaining. And again, he's alone. There's no family there. And he doesn't seem to be able to take care of himself. He's alone, he's on his own, and he is ailing, he is sick. Okay. So the change here is the change in the seasons and of a place as well. It's been winter and cold, and now spring is coming and summer. And although we're not told explicitly, he is in Jerusalem. We don't know that, but we know that the doctor says you should go where? You should go to Tel Aviv. Now, as you probably know from the geography, Jerusalem is a hill or a mountain city where the winters are difficult. It's kind of rainy and cold. And Tel Aviv is on the plain of the Mediterranean. The spring comes much earlier, and it's warm there. So, you know, especially in the winter, if you leave Jerusalem and go to Tel Aviv, it's like a different world. You're on the Mediterranean, and the sun is out, and it's warm. And Jerusalem can be very cold. So we have the place and the season changes with the hope that he will be cured, that he will be better. And so he's advised to be by the ocean, and the issue becomes, where can he find a place to be? And he finds a place, and that place is not very comfortable. It's in the middle of the city, it's noisy, he tries to go to sleep, and the buses are running, and the garbage trucks, and the sellers of soda are moving their crates. And not only that, but the family he's with is a terrible family. You know, the man doesn't have a job, he spends all day looking for a job, and the woman is a do-gooder. She's some kind of bureaucrat for Zionist causes. She's never home. And they have this child who they seem not to want. The child is a neglected, abandoned child, and the child connects to the narrator. And the narrator has some kind of feelings for the child. And the child is disgusting and sick, and so the quest for a place to be able to really rest, to get well, to sleep, is the mission he's on. And this room is terrible because of the noise, because of this toddler. He doesn't want to leave because the toddler is going to kind of attach himself to him. He's so tired, he schleps himself to the ocean, and he's even too weak to take off his other shoe. He's there. And he has to move, but he can't do it himself. And who helps him find another place?
His friends.
His friends.
His friends. Well, not all of his friends, but one friend. All of his friends tell him, you really should change, but they don't do anything for him. But there is one friend who actually goes and finds him a different place. And that place is beautiful. It's a kind of a fairy tale place. It's in the city of Tel Aviv, but it's in a grove of trees and a little hill which set it apart. And the story of the older couple there is a very wonderful story. It's about a man who decided to leave and come to the land of Israel, and he tried to invest in properties in the city, but realized that wasn't for him. And they have a daughter who was very idealistic and has gone to live on kibbutz. And it is a beautiful room, and he sees that this is the place where he'll be able to rest. Okay, it seems to be like, this is great. So he takes an 8 or 9 day trip around the cities of the agricultural settlements and the kibbutzim in the north. And he leaves the city, and that's very important here. And he goes to where people are actually working the land. And he meets the daughter of the family as well. And he says, if I were a different person, I would have stayed there. I would have stayed on a kibbutz or on a moshav, and I would have been very happy. But he doesn't. He comes back, and he goes and he gets his belongings from the flat, and he has a porter walk with him to the new house. And just as he's about to get settled in, he turns around and he goes back, and he goes back to the old place, which is dirty and dusty and noisy and where there's no sleep, and that's the end of the story. So we only have a few minutes, but why does he do that?
Maybe this wonderful place is too perfect for him.
It's too perfect for him.
Maybe.
I wouldn't have minded. You know. I could have dealt with it, but it's kind of.
Maybe he realized that his home is where a child, that child, which he loved when he was at that house, and
I think one has to go in that direction. In other words, that he's brought back by some emotional
because
bond
he
to the
looked
child.
on the throat of this new apartment, and he doesn't see this small boy who was always waiting for him on the throat near the door. So this was the most important thing what he missed in this new beautiful flat.
Right.
Maybe the old flat with this child is some kind of Yiddish culture, Ashkenazi culture, and this new flat in the desert, a new house, is maybe some Zionist culture, and he think, oh, I like all the Yiddish culture, and he chooses this culture.
I don't know. You'd have to. I don't see much about the husband and wife of the child that connects them to the old world and to Yiddish culture. She's involved in the Zionist bureaucracy of one sort or another. So that would be an interesting approach, but you'd have to, in order to make that argument, you'd have to show something about they're using Yiddish terms or being connected to the old world. I don't see that so much. There doesn't seem to be anything special about them. What is special is this child, and it's very, very, very non-perfect and non-ideal, that he's a child who is neglected. And apparently there is something in the narrator that responds to being needed by this child. Now the narrator is alone. We don't hear anything about his having a family. That's his aloneness is what defines him. And he's alone, trying to cure himself. And the prescription for the cure is being more alone. That is having rest and tranquility and being able to sleep. And that's the ultimate in being alone. So there is something very positive in him. There's some emotional life that is still alive that responds to the child, even though the child is sickly and dependent and not ideal in any way. But his response to the child has the effect of expanding the notion of what an acceptable home would be, or an acceptable dwelling or lodging. So we were forced to compare the two lodgings, one which is so lovely and so nice and so tranquil, and the one in the city where the husband and wife are not particularly nice, whereas the ones on the hill are so very lovely together, and they have a beautiful daughter who is doing idealistic things, as opposed to this couple who has a neglected child. And the story is very critical of the mother who's saving the nation, but letting her child, kind of eat lead paint, dust on the floor. So, and the narrator feels needed. There's something in him that is made alive, or we might say brought back to health or healed in a way which isn't obvious, by the emotional response that he has to the child, so that his being able to find health after being sick is not a matter of being isolated and finding rest and tranquility alone, but of his being connected to another human being, which he has not been, even if it's this child. And that connection is what makes this physical room, which is very unappealing, into what might be called a home. Very temporary for the moment. It's a very short story for an episode, but it's the presence of that human relationship of dependence or being needed that transforms space into the possibility of being a home for him. Now that home is so very different from the home we saw in the story of the kerchief, which is an idealization of the Jewish family. And in that sense, it's very far from what the ideal religious family of Eastern Europe would be. But in what we would call a fallen world, a world after the fall, after the loss of religion, even that connection can make what is simply a space also into a home. Okay, we reached our time for today. So we'll go on to two very different stories tomorrow. Stories about love, and I think you'll find them very interesting, and we'll continue our discussion then. You know, today is Israel Independence Day, and is it 68 years since 1948, and so in Israel today is a holiday, and yesterday was the Memorial Day for those who died in wars, and today is the day of great celebration. Okay, I raise my glass.